Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Backyard Forestry for May 2025. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the spongy moth, and our guest is Ben Pisano. Ben works for the New Jersey Forest Service. He has a master's degree in ecology and evolution from Rutgers, and he's been working for the Forest Service since 2019. And he has also been a presenter for the New Jersey Forestry Association at our annual meeting. So you may already know Ben from that meeting, but if not, Ben is very, very knowledgeable about this subject and very passionate about it. And we're looking forward to his presentation to provide you with the most information and the information that you need to move forward with treating your trees if necessary. I wanted to thank Dr. Cass Urban Mead for participating in last month's BYF. She did a great presentation on pollinators in the woods, and that presentation is now live on our YouTube channel. Just wanted to ask you, as I do often, but it's necessary to do so, especially as grant funding is less prevalent than it was previously, to please join or donate to the association. We're a 501c3, as you know, and we're an all-volunteer working board and working officer group. So we would appreciate your support. If you can do it, please do. And now, without further ado, Ben Pisano on the spongy moth.
Let me share screen. Spoiling it a little bit early. Okay, cool. So that should be in presentation mode.
Yes, it is.
Awesome. Yeah, so as Rick said, I'm Ben Pisano. I work for the New Jersey Forest Service. I'm a GIS specialist that also works in the forest health program as well as our state lands management program. So today I'm going to hopefully give you kind of a pretty comprehensive understanding of spongy moth, which has a few different names. It used to be named Gypsy Moth. Some people call it LDD, which is an abbreviation of the scientific name, which is Lymantria dispar. So first I'll go through some background, kind of what this pest is, the origin of it, and its history in New Jersey. I'll talk about its life cycle, how to ID it, and some of the common caterpillar lookalikes that we have in New Jersey. I'll talk about 3 different biological controls and identify and define what a biological control is. I'll talk about the defoliation in New Jersey, so recent defoliation, as well as some of the historical trends of spongy moth. Next, I'll go into some management options. And then finally, I'll kind of end with a spiel I put into a lot of these presentations I do regarding forest health with some of the outreach materials that New Jersey Forest Service provides in general. So moving right into it. Let me see. Let me move this sharing panel if I can. There you go. Okay. So starting with just some general info. So it's a defoliating insect that was brought over from Europe in the 1800s. As I mentioned, it was formerly known as gypsy moth. Some other people will call it LDD, which is an abbreviation of the scientific name, Lymantria dispar, so LDD. It was renamed in 2022, so pretty recently, by ESA, which is the Entomology Society of America, and they renamed it due to the discriminatory nature of the word gypsy. So this is what the caterpillar of the spongy moth looks like. So I'll kind of interchange calling it either spongy moth. Sometimes I'll slip up and call it gypsy moth just because that's what I've worked with it as for a while, or I'll call it LDD. So all of them are referring to the same insect. Let's see if I can. Okay, cool. Oh, I think I went 1, 2, 4. Oh, there we go. So now I'll talk about some of the impacted species. So primarily in New Jersey, we see it defoliating oaks, but it can defoliate other species, especially when populations are so high or a lot of the oaks in the area have been defoliated. So other preferred host species include aspen, birch, sweet gum, willow, basswood, apple, or cherry. And then this other column I've called non-preferred species. I don't know if resistant is the right word because I've seen them defoliate these trees when there's none of their preferred hosts in the area. I've also even seen them defoliate conifers or evergreen trees when populations are so bad. But some of the common unpreferred or non-preferred species include um, holly, black locust, mulberry, sycamore, tulip tree or tulip poplar, ash, rhododendron, and then mulberry. Or sorry, it was mountain laurel. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. Sorry about that. Okay, so some kind of just general concerns with mostly the caterpillar. So there are health concerns that the caterpillar can cause. They have these kind of spiny hair-like features on the outside of the caterpillar's body. So when you come in contact with them, depending on people's allergy responses, it can cause a rash, or if these spines or hairs get airborne and you inhale them, sometimes you can feel some respiratory effects from them. Another thing to note is with repeated defoliations of trees, it can cause tree mortality. So this creates not only dead hazard trees, it can be expensive to remove these hazardous trees. A lot of standing dead trees can increase fire load, which is something we've seen a lot throughout the United States and New Jersey recently. And defoliation of trees causes destruction of a lot of important habitat, especially in the northern part of the state, where you see the predominance of oak forest types. So this is some aerial images of spongy moth tree defoliations. So this is when populations get pretty bad and will defoliate entire parcels or forest stands of trees. So we see on this image on the left, they don't really discriminate. They'll go right up to houses, and then on the right we see more of a contiguous forest where you can see the line of defoliation versus what healthy trees are looking like. So now onto the background or origin of spongy moth. So spongy moth was originally brought over by Etienne Leopold Trevoulot from Europe in 1869 to Massachusetts, specifically Medford, Massachusetts. Etienne had hoped to interbreed spongy moth caterpillars with a different silk moth or caterpillar, and this was in hopes to create a new silkworm industry in America. Unfortunately, the moths escaped his residence in Medford, Massachusetts, and kind of have been causing a lot of destruction and defoliation ever since. So after the moths escaped, there's kind of two popular tales of what happened. The first is that Etienne did indeed report the escape and the potential consequences of the escape and how much damage these spongy moth can cause in the natural environment. But even after warning, no officials helped or showed interest in kind of solving this issue. The other account is that Etienne knew of the risk, but ended up not contacting the officials to warn of the escape. Not really sure which one is true. I'd like to think the first one is true, at least in terms of Etienne responding, but I guess we'll never know. So within the first decade of their escape, noticeable damage was observed in the wild from spongy moth, and it was attributed to spongy moth. So here on the top right, we can see a map. So this is a map from the U.S. Forest Service. We can kind of see their spread from Massachusetts going up north to Maine and then working its way south and southwest. First being detected in New Jersey in 1920. I believe the first detection in 1920 in New Jersey was at what is now Duke Farms. It used to be called the Duke Estate. I think it actually was not spread from the Maine's outbreak. I think it was actually introduced on some European spruce trees that were sent over from Europe. So that definitely did not help that cause. So as I said, the first outbreak was observed in 1889, and this is when people in public noticed mass tree defoliation and a lot of the younger caterpillars falling down on them. So it even reached the Pacific Northwest. As they realized how bad and how damaging this pest could be, there was a lot of eradication campaigns that took place. Some of them were successful. So the eradication campaigns in the Pacific Northwest were successful. So that's why spongy moth is not in that region of the United States. But unfortunately, they were not successful in the Northeast, which is why we still deal with it in our region today. So this is a current distribution map of spongy moth in the United States. So the blue area is the or the suppression area. So these are states that have established spongy moth populations. And then this kind of lighter turquoise color, hopefully you can see my mouse cursor. This is the slow the spread area. So this is an area where they kind of try to focus on eradication or really stop the insect from spreading as much as possible. Whereas in our region, it's pretty much hopeless at this point to eradicate this insect, but you do suppress it by limiting the load that's on that kind of outer invasion front. And then this other color of blue, I believe, is like special watch areas of where the spongy moth could transfer, or I guess spread from these suppression areas to the slow to spread areas. And I believe this is from 2020, so I'm sure it's kind of progressed more and more since then. But this is from 2020, provided by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So now I'll go over the life cycle ID and kind of like progression of spongy moth throughout a year. So the first thing to look for, the earliest stage of spongy moth, is egg masses. So the egg masses are this buff tan color. So we can see an egg mass in this tree bark crevice of what I believe is a chestnut oak, and as well as on the underside of the limb of this red oak. So this is actually at the botanical gardens up by Ringwood State Park. So you can see very heavy infestation here. So they're normally tan color. You normally can find them in shaded or protected areas. Often on trees, you find them either in the crevices of the trees or the branch underside of trees. The next stage is caterpillars. So the caterpillar is identified through its 6 pairs of red dots and 5 pairs of blue dots. So on this image on the right, you can see the 6 pairs of red dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the 5 pairs of blue dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then right on the head is 5. So I really wanted to show this image because it shows different instars, which are more or less I'll talk about instars and kind of the molting process between instars, but spongy moth caterpillars will either go through 5 or 6 instar stages throughout a year, and an instar stage is essentially progression of a caterpillar to a larger caterpillar. So on the left, we see probably a younger instar, probably the first or second instar, and on the right, we can see kind of a diversity of instars, with this middle small one probably being a first instar, this one to the right probably being third, and then the one on the left probably being 3 or 4. And then the image on the right is a late instar or an adult caterpillar, so that's probably the 5th or 6th instar. So following the kind of different instar stages of the caterpillar, we go to this pupa stage. So late instar caterpillar, so this is either instar 5 or instar 6. They'll spin a cocoon and they pupate. So this is what the pupa looks like. This image on the left is an intact pupa case, and the image on the right is a residual pupa. So this is a pupa that is left behind after an actual adult moth emerges from this. So the pupation stage lasts for about 10 to 14 days, where a moth emerges from the pupal case. And a lot of times, as on this image on the right, you'll sometimes see residual pupal cases where the actual moth has come out, but you'll still sometimes see egg masses in that area too. So the next stage is the actual adult moths. So there are female and male adult moths. So these 2 images on the left are female moths. So they have this white color. It's important to note that female moths are entirely flightless. So a lot of times wherever they pupate out, they stay within that tree or a neighboring tree. Male moths can fly, and they're identified by their darker brown color and their very fuzzy antenna. So you can really distinguish between female moths and male moths by their colors, as well as the difference in antenna. And you can see on this image on the bottom, this is a female moth actually laying an egg mass. So now kind of going into some lookalikes. So the 2 most common lookalikes for spongy moth are the eastern tent caterpillar, which is this kind of these top images. So the eastern tent caterpillar, it does make a tent. So it makes this kind of webby tent that has a lot of the eggs inside that eventually, the caterpillars will come out from. And it has a pretty different color. So it has, this one over here. So it has this line on its back that's pretty identifiable. It has a dark head and a prominent white or yellow stripe down the center of the body. So that's what this is here. And then it has these kind of blue spots on the side of it, right? Whereas spongy moth, you're looking for the sets of blue dots and the sets of red dots. And then the other is the forest tent caterpillar. So this has a blue head. It has a prominent central row of white or yellow markings. So you can see these white or yellow markings. And then it has the bluish side. So a lot of times if you see a lot of this kind of continuous blue pattern on the side of a caterpillar, it's likely eastern tent caterpillar or forest tent caterpillar. And forest tent caterpillar, they don't really make these webby tents. They kind of just aggregate on the side of this tree in this image here, which is kind of gross. And what's important to note, both of these caterpillars lay egg masses that kind of go around the circumference of a branch, whereas spongy moth lay these kind of circular fixed egg masses that only cover like a specific part of the tree. They will go around the entire circumference of the tree as a single egg mass. So both these caterpillars, they will defoliate trees. They can get to population levels where they are problematic. I believe both of them are native. I know eastern tent caterpillar is native. I think forest tent caterpillar is native as well. But the defoliation they cause is normally never as prolific as the spongy moth defoliation. And that's because these caterpillars being native have a lot of natural pests or sorry, natural predators in the region that you find them. So kind of going more into depth into the timing of the yearly life cycle. So here's a great image. I believe this is from Ohio. So starting in late April or early May, this is where the egg masses that we saw, those buff tan egg masses hatch, and the first instar caterpillars emerge. The first instars are black in color, so they won't actually have those identifiable paired color dots on their back. Then starting in late April through June, the males and the females go through their different instar stages. It's important to note that males will only complete or go through 5 instar stages, whereas females will go through 6 instar stages. And kind of building off what that means, completing an instar is when a caterpillar molts its current exoskeleton, and then a larger instar or caterpillar emerges from the exoskeleton. And the red and blue identifying features of the spongy moth caterpillars normally are not observed until the second instar. And it's important to note, young instars, so instar 1 through 3, feed during the day, whereas older instars, normally 4, 5, and 6, will feed during the nighttime. Okay, so kind of moving on. So in late June and early July, after completing all their instar stages, the caterpillars will enter that pupation stage where they create a cocoon or a pupa. And this stage, as I mentioned, lasts for 10 to 14 days. Then come late July, early August, male or female moths will emerge from the pupal case and immediately begin mating. So it's important to note that the female moths are flightless, so they do release pheromones to attract their male counterpart mates. There is a form of pheromone disruption to kind of prevent mating and limit mating with spongy moths. That's not something New Jersey does, but I believe some adjacent states, specifically PA, might implement that into their management program. Adult moths also do not feed, and they only survive several days. So they're pretty much there to mate so the female can lay eggs. And then moth infestations, they can kind of appear longer than that 2 or 3 days that the adult moths survive. And this is due to pupal emergence variation. So, you might have some pupation where an adult moth comes out of the pupa in late July, whereas some come out in early August. So it seems like the moths are surviving a lot longer than they actually are, but they're actually different moths from different pupa. And then after mating, each male will lay a single egg mass. And on average, or typically, this egg mass will have about 250 eggs, but sometimes they can have as many as 1,000 eggs, right? So if all of those eggs in the egg mass are viable, one female moth can create 250, potential caterpillars or early instars the following year. So these moths will overwinter, and then the cycle begins again, starting in that late April, May area. So it's important to kind of keep in mind that spongy moth only go through one generation. So generation is starting as an egg and then ending as an adult. So one generation within a year. Whereas other insects and pests, they can go through multiple generations through a year. So now I'll move on to biological controls. So AI is kind of the buzz right now. So I thought it would be funny to ask ChatGPT, which is a popular AI application or instrument, what biological control is. And it did a pretty spot on job defining it. So it defined biological controls as a method of controlling pests, diseases, and invasive species using natural enemies such as predators, parasites, or pathogens. It's an environmentally friendly alternative to chemical pesticide and can help maintain ecological balance. And then it defined it into three main categories. So classical biological control, so introducing natural enemies from a pest's native habitat to control the population in its new environment. So that would be bringing biological controls from Europe or Asia, where you find spongy moth, to the United States. Then there's augmentative biological controls. So these are releasing large numbers of natural enemies to boost their population and suppress pests. So that's kind of just building on that classical biological control. If the biological controls in that area is releasing more of them to really bolster their numbers so they can have more control than maybe they initially had. And then conservation biological control. Sorry, I think I pressed spacebar, so it muted. So enhancing conditions that support natural enemies, such as planting flowers to attract pollinators or reduce pesticide use. So now that we know what a biological control is, let's see if it's, there you go, sorry, it froze for a second. So now I'm going to go through three of kind of the most common biological controls that you might observe during the spongy moth caterpillar season in New Jersey. I believe overall in the United States, there's been like 40 biological controls that have been released through history to try to control spongy moth. But these three that I'm going to go through are kind of the ones we see active or really that have actually established in the wild and we've seen have an impact to help control and knock back the spongy moth populations. So the first one I'm going to mention is Entomophaga mymega. So this is a fungus that is native to Japan. So there are spongy moth in Japan, and you can observe it kind of in the wild and see it's established by looking at cadaver, which are these dead spongy moth caterpillars. So this left image is a caterpillar or cadaver caterpillar that has been killed by Entomophaga mymega. You can see it's kind of like more or less shrunken these caterpillars and caused mortality in them. And you can even see that this top caterpillar was likely an early instar because you don't notice the patterns on the back of it like this bottom caterpillar. So the fungus is spread through spores that are ejected from the cadaver. So, for example, if since these caterpillars were killed by Entomophaga mymega, it can help kind of spread the fungus more. So the spores enter through, I believe it's the gut of the I think it's the gut. Sorry, I left that out. So I think it enters through the gut and it depletes nutrients, leading to death of the caterpillar. So since it's a fungus, weather plays an important role in the success of Entomophaga mymega. Just like a lot of mushrooms you see outside this time of year are driven by the wet spring we've been having. So building off of this, dry springs hinder the ability of the fungus to reproduce, whereas wet springs, particularly in May and June, can lead to population booms of the fungus, and this provides much better and larger control of spongy moth. So this fungus was initially released in 1910 and 1911 in Boston, Massachusetts. And in 1912, after the initial release, they kind of went back to check to see if it was established. And they didn't really see any effect on spongy moth, so they kind of labeled it as a failure. But later in the 1980s, they did additional releases in 1985 and 1986 in both New York State and Shenandoah National Park, kind of in that Virginia area. And, within 5 or so years of that secondary release of this fungus, they noticed a lot of these cadaver spongy moth in the wild. So that's kind of proof that it had started to establish pretty significantly. The next biocontrol I'm going to talk about is a virus. So it's nucleopolyhedrosis virus, or NPV for short. So it's a virus that's native to both Europe and Asia. It's transmitted orally as caterpillars ingest plant material that has been exposed to NPV. So the virus invades through the gut and reproduces internally. And this causes disintegration of internal organs and death within 10 or 14 days of ingestion. Um, so sorry, this one enters through the gut. I believe the other one is through the actual cuticle. So if the spores just kind of contact the outside of the caterpillar with the fungus, that is how it enters the caterpillar. But so going back to NPV, so to observe NPV in the wild, you kind of look for this upside down V shape of a dead caterpillar, and that's signs that it was killed or it succumbed to the actual virus. So this virus is considered epizootic, so it causes limited mortality or control of spongy moth when population or population density of spongy moth are low, but it can cause or it can result in very high mortality or control when populations kind of hit this threshold. And this is just because of transmissibility of the virus, which is something we saw recently with COVID. When you have a lot of people in an area, it's more likely for a virus to transfer. Same thing with flu season and everything else. So what's interesting about this virus is it has been manufactured as a pesticide to control spongy moth. The actual product is known as Gypcheck. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to produce. In order to produce it, you actually have to collect these cadaver caterpillars that show symptoms of being or signs of being killed by NPV, and then you actually propagate this Gypcheck product from those dead caterpillars. So it's not the most practical to produce. It works pretty well, especially when populations get high enough, but it's very expensive to produce. And because of this, it's only made available to government entities. So a combination of difficulty to produce and limited quantities is kind of why this isn't more commonly used. And the fact that it has kind of been established in the environment, they're hoping it kind of just proliferates and becomes more and more ubiquitous as time goes by or as populations increase. So the last biological control I'm going to talk about is definitely the least effective of the three. It's a parasitoid wasp biocontrol. So the scientific name is Oencertis cuvune, I believe is how it's pronounced. It's a parasitic wasp that's native to Japan. It was introduced in the United States in the early 1900s, kind of the same time frame when they were trying to find more of these natural remedies to spongy moth when it really started to become problematic. It's an egg parasitoid, so the way it works is the female parasitoid wasp will lay its eggs inside of spongy moth eggs, and then from the spongy moth eggs, a parasitoid larva will use it as a nutrient source, and larva will emerge from this, and then eventually a wasp comes from this larva. So it essentially turns what would have been a spongy moth caterpillar from a spongy moth egg into a parasitic wasp egg, where eventually a parasitic wasp will emerge from. So since they do more or less have to inject their own eggs into the spongy moth eggs, it normally only interferes with the upper layer of a spongy moth egg mass. And unfortunately, they're not entirely specific to spongy moth egg masses. So the efficacy of them year to year is really limited to their availability to access other hosts' eggs to parasitize. So this is what they look like on the left. These small kind of perfectly circular circles are the actual eggs inside the buff tan spongy moth egg mass, and these are the parasitic flies kind of going to work. This is a zoomed image, and this is what it looks like actually on the egg mass near an adult female spongy moth. So now I'll go through some
Ben, could I
historical.
interrupt you just for a second
Yeah,
with a
absolutely.
question? And by the way, if anybody has any questions, throw them up in the chat and we'll try to peek at them as we move along. But going back to those the three methods that you identified, or three processes you identified just now,
Mhm.
are any of them present in New Jersey?
Yes, yes. So all of them can be observed in New Jersey. So if you're out, and let me see if I can go back. I'm struggling to, there you go. So I would say within the month of June, if you go out to an area that's been infested with spongy moth caterpillars and you observe some dead caterpillars on the trees in that area, if they're kind of these desiccated caterpillars that are in a straight line, it's likely mortality caused by this fungus, Entomophaga mymega. And then if you see this in this, N shape or upside down V, it's likely mortality caused by this nucleopolyhedrosis virus. So you do observe them, and they do help dramatically to reduce spongy moth populations, with the fungus dramatically causing reductions if we have these wet springs that we're having. So hopefully we see some control from the fungus this year. And then the virus is really dependent on this higher density or higher population of spongy moth, which I'm going to get into. We're kind of in an outbreak, so hopefully we see some of this kind of out on our hikes as well. And
So
then
I'll leverage on the word hopefully,
yes,
just
yeah.
so that to landowners, you can't rely on these as being the mechanism of fighting. If you see an infestation in your forest, you can't say, "Oh, I'm going to rely on that fungus appearing."
Yes, exactly. Yeah, these are kind of like supplemental that really help along with um actual like spongy moth management programs or suppression programs that are implemented by New Jersey DEP, New Jersey Agriculture in cooperation with municipalities. So that's kind of like the IPM approach, integrated pest management. So looking for biological controls, looking for physical or mechanical controls, and then using your chemicals or biological um, controls when needed. So going back into historic defoliation, so spongy moth is considered a cyclical pest. So you'll see kind of these boom and bust cycles of populations. So this is a historic graph of defoliations with the acres of defoliation on this y-axis over here, and then the actual year of the defoliation on this x-axis. So the blue bars are defoliation in acres, and then the red bars, which are kind of hard to see in the background, are the number of acres that have actually been treated by this state program that we have. So we can see in 1970, we're at about a little over 100,000. This gets to about 250,000 acres of defoliation and then drops off. So this is in combination with, you can kind of see it's small, repeated suppression programs through treatment of acreage, as well as, reaching this kind of threshold where that NPV virus really starts to proliferate as the populations are so big and causes this dramatic drop off. I believe 1980 or 19, yeah, I think it was 1980 was when we saw the greatest defoliation caused by spongy moth. We saw about 800,000 acres, and within the next 2 or 3 years, this dropped down, quite a bit into the 100,000 acres. If you look at more recently, we've been, pretty good at controlling it through just kind of, I think, understanding it a little bit better, and then probably the spreading of those biocontrols to help us out a bit. So, within the last 5 years, we've, had anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000 acres of defoliation. With this most recent year, which would be last year, having quite a significant spike, which I'll go into now. Um, so just kind of identifying how the defoliation is recorded. So New Jersey Department of Agriculture, that's NJDA, you'll see me call it that, kind of progressing through this presentation. So Department of Agriculture conducts aerial defoliation surveys each year in June. So June is pretty much, late June is the end of any defoliation that's going to be caused by spongy moth. So that's why it's important to do it in June and no earlier. And this allows us to map defoliation by acreage caused by these spongy moth caterpillars. So the two most recent defoliation surveys that New Jersey Department of Agriculture did was June 2023 and June 2024. Next month, June 2025, we'll get an updated one to see kind of what it looks like for this year and this coming year. So in 2023, there was about 6,000 acres of defoliation. And then 1 year later, we saw a 9 times increase, which is pretty dramatic, up to 140,000 acres. So if we go back to this previous figure, we can see. So this is 2023 at 16,000 acres, and then 2024 jumping up to this 140,000, right? So very limited kind of population of spongy moth, and then this big boom. So we kind of expect, following some of these historic trends, to probably see the next year or two to even have more defoliation, in 2020, this year in 2025 and in 2026. But a lot of that is dependent on how well the suppression program that I'm going to talk about works, and then how well and how much relief we get by those 3 biocontrols that I mentioned. Okay, so this is what the defoliation looks like actually on a map. So we can see these kind of black dots are defoliation that was mapped in that aerial defoliation survey. So kind of historically, pre-2023, a lot of the defoliation you would see is kind of in this area of Cape May where my cursor is, as well as in Burlington County. But we noticed in 2023 a lot of defoliation up in Sussex County. And this is largely what we hypothesize to be from an infestation that is in northeastern PA, which they're just starting to get a control over. So a lot of these, a lot of the infestation is blowing across the Delaware River, as well as New York State. Spongy moth doesn't care about state boundaries. And New York State, they don't regularly suppress spongy moth. They wait till it gets to these, really bad levels, and then we'll conduct and implement a suppression program. So we think a lot of the spongy moth that's showing up as of 2023 in Sussex County is kind of sourced from those areas, as well as some of the federal lands in Sussex County that aren't actively managed. So you can see we have a 9 times increase in 2024, where the population just kind of exploded to that greater, northern Sussex County region, and it's starting to move its way east into eastern Sussex County, central Passaic County, and even into western Bergen County. So for state lands, this is like Stokes State Forest, High Point State Park, Wawayanda State Park, Ringwood State Park. That's kind of the areas that we're looking at to implement a suppression program. So this was provided by New Jersey Department of Agriculture. So as I progress through this slide, the red polygons you see show up are defoliation. I think it's like the last 2 or 3 years of defoliation. And then after that, you'll see blue polygons, which are the last 2 years of locations where we've done aerial suppression of spongy moth. So this is where an actual fixed wing plane flies over and sprays a product that I'll talk about shortly to kind of suppress these populations. So I believe this is 2022 defoliation survey. So you can see a lot of it in Burlington County, some in Cape May. Then 2023, we notice the Sussex County kind of population starting to take off. And then the last one, 2024, it kind of just explodes in Sussex County. And then I believe this is the 2023 suppression program. So a lot of treatment emphasized in this Sussex County area with some small suppression in Burlington and Cape May, as well as a little bit in that eastern Passaic County. And then this is what we plan for this year up in Sussex County. So a lot in Sussex County and then quite a bit in Passaic, some even in Morris as well. Okay, so kind of how we determine where our aerial suppression program is going to take place. So we use the defoliation, the aerial defoliation surveys to kind of pin us into the location on the ground. And then we kind of ground truth those aerial defoliation surveys through use and conducting egg mass surveys. So on the left, this is what your typical egg mass survey looks like. We record the county, the local municipality, the plot location, so that would be exact coordinates, and then, just some other identifying features in the map ID. And the way the egg mass survey works is we conduct an egg mass survey at 3 different sites. So each of these sites are separated by 100 feet. And at a site, we pretty much, just pick a center point of this plot, and then we count the egg masses on up to 10 trees or more trees in this kind of mini plot and take note of how many egg masses there are on each tree. So we look at egg masses on the tree that are pretty much within eye level, so 6 feet or lower of the trunk of the tree, and then egg masses above 6 feet. And that's because if you see egg masses lower on the tree, it's normally indicative that it's a higher population of spongy moth because they tend to be in the canopy of the tree. When there's no room for eggs in the canopy of the tree, they start to migrate down and then lay their egg masses on the lower part of the tree. So we do that 3 times. We do some math, and then we can get an understanding of how many egg masses there are per acre of land. And you do one of these 3 site surveys, as you kind of walk on the side of the road or through high traffic areas on state lands or around people's houses for your municipal lands to get a sense of what the density of egg masses are per acre of area. So these egg mass surveys, similar to our aerial suppression program, which I'll get into shortly, it's a cooperative program between New Jersey Forest Service and the Department of Agriculture. So New Jersey Forest Service, so that's me and kind of my team and my crew, we survey for egg masses only on state land. So these are state wildlife management areas, state parks, state forests, and then some of our natural lands trust lands as well. Whereas New Jersey Department of Agriculture, so that's the agriculture, their crew, they survey for egg masses on municipal lands and then I believe private like homeowners' lands on in those municipalities as well. And I believe the way it works is, say you're a private homeowner and you don't want your land to be part of a suppression program. I believe you're mailed a letter saying, hey, we plan to suppress spongy moth in your area. I believe you can opt out of it, which most people will not opt out of it because it is helpful. But so the egg mass surveys are conducted in late summer just to make sure all of the adult moths have kind of gone through their mating, that if they're going to mate and then lay their egg masses, we don't want to survey and then have more egg masses laid later on. And as I mentioned, the locations for where we conduct the egg mass surveys are guided by our aerial survey. And then the surveys are used to determine the need and extent of an annual suppression program. So what's important about these surveys is it does give you an egg mass count per acre, and that determines the need for either a single application from our aerial suppression program or a double application. So a single application is where the plane will fly over that area that's been deemed needing a suppression program one time and treat it one time. A double application is where it'll treat it, the plane will come over, fly over, treat that parcel of land one time, and then come back later and then treat it a second time because populations are so high, you really need that second application to get the control you want to see of the caterpillars in that area. So the numbers we use, if we count 520 egg masses per acre, anything that's above that, up to 4,000 egg masses per acre, is a single application zone or what we call spray block. And then if you have 4,000 egg masses or more per acre in an area, that's an area that will be a double application spray block. So as I said, New Jersey Forest Service surveys state lands, and we're responsible for any potential management that would occur on state lands. And it's important to note that suppression programs on state lands are typically 100% federally funded. So unfortunately, over the last couple years, they've been putting less emphasis on funding state programs in that suppression zone, which is the dark blue, which is the greater northeast of that previous distribution map I showed. And more of that funding is going to slow the spread. I think the thought process is if they can keep it from spreading, that kind of lowers the budget as a whole. But kind of how I've looked at it and how I've talked to, a lot of my partners in the other states, the amount of stress in that slow to spread area is really dictated by populations in the suppression area, right? So as populations get larger and larger in the suppression area, the moths will lay egg masses on whatever they can. That includes, lawn furniture or, moving trucks or people's vehicles. And then those vehicles go across state lines and then, essentially just put more pressure on that slow to spread area. So I think there's definitely more need for federal funding in our area in New Jersey. So now moving on to New Jersey Department of Agriculture, they survey municipal lands and they're responsible for implementing any potential management on municipal lands. The municipal program, so it's one joint program, but the municipal half of the program is a little different. They're a cost share program. So the cost share program, typically how it works is New Jersey Department of Agriculture will pay for 50% of the program using federal money. So this is the same pot of money that the state land portion of the program would potentially get. And then the other 50% of this cost share program is the responsibility of the municipality. Since funding by federal sources has been so limited, NJ Department of Ag doesn't want to just say, hey, there's no federal money, we don't want to do a program. So they've kind of been trying to adjust their program by still offering a program, but making the municipalities understand they might have to pay more than their 50% in order for the program to actually be implemented. And again, just because Department of Agriculture through aerial defoliation surveys and their egg mass surveys deems that a municipality should have a suppression program, the municipality does have the option to either opt into the program or opt out of the program. And a lot of what drives that is, the cost of the program and how much federal aid New Jersey Department of Agriculture is going to get for that cost share. So in terms of what we plan to do this year in 2025, so our current suppression program is already underway. The southern part of the county was completed last week, and the majority of our program, which is going to be in northern New Jersey, specifically where we saw on that map up in Sussex and Passaic County, that's actually starting next week, next Monday. So our total program this year is going to be about 7,500 acres statewide, with about half that acreage on state lands, and that's conducted. I believe down south they had from May 5th to June 5th to complete. They finished that very quickly in a few days because weather cooperated. For up north, we have between May 15th and June 15th to complete the program. Normally, it only takes about 5 total days, maybe about 3 days of the first week for the single applications, and then any sites that need that second application coming back the week after to complete them. So hopefully we're done even before we get to June. And as I mentioned, on state lands and municipal lands this year, most of it is in that northern portion of the state, specifically Sussex County, Passaic County, and that western Bergen County. So unfortunately, closer to 15,000 acres were actually proposed for treatment this year, as opposed to the 7,500 we're actually treating. But several large acreage municipalities opted out of the program. And this is largely due to high costs associated, since we're kind of in that outbreak portion of the spongy moth cycle we're seeing, and because of less federal funding being available. So Department of Ag's, more or less approaching those municipalities saying, hey, there's a lot to spray this year, and unfortunately we're not getting as much support financially from the federal government, so we might not be able to cover the 50% that we normally do. So some municipalities just can't afford to opt into the program, unfortunately. So this is just a quick little video of what one of the spray paint planes looks like that we use for the state program. So this is, it's the same plane that will spray municipal lands as well as state lands. So you can kind of see this underneath of the plane is actual prop that sprays this fine mist. And this is a Department of Agriculture member calibrating this mist spray to make sure the droplet size is proper, so you get the proper coverage per volume of product on it. So this is kind of what it looks like as it's spraying. It's a little bit loud because the plane is running, but I just wanted to show everyone. So they're actually calibrating it, as I said, and there's like, these planes come from down south. So as they're on transport, sometimes the stuff gets knocked around. So they want to recalibrate it. So we're essentially getting the highest efficacy we can for the amount of product we're applying. And then this is what the actual spray program looks like on the ground. So this is that same model of plane spraying this line of oak trees that I believe this is municipal land. So through aerial defoliation egg mass surveys, agriculture has deemed that this should be a spray block. So the plane comes and sprays this parcel of land. And then you'll see in the background, there's actually a chase plane. So a member of Department of Agriculture is in a plane that's at a much higher elevation. That's kind of following the spray plane to kind of help them key in on, where they should be spraying and making sure the spraying is going as it should be. Just because obviously the pilot of the spray plane cannot see the prop that they're spraying behind them. Okay, so now I'll talk about the product that New Jersey uses in the spray program. So this is our cooperative state program. So this is the same product that is used with Department of Agriculture and New Jersey Forest Service on both state lands and then municipal and private lands. So this is the only product from my understanding, we're legally allowed to use, and it's because it's a relatively safe product. So the product is known as BTK for short, or Bacillus thuringiensis, and the variety is Kostaki. So this is a BTK fact sheet that we hand out to, or Department of Agriculture hands out to the municipalities that are opting into the spray program. Us with DEP, New Jersey Forest Service, we hand this out to people on the ground if they're camping, if they're in a picnic area, We give them to our park offices, so you can find them there if you want to. But I'll just kind of read this. It's a lot, but I think it's important to share with you guys. So BTK is among the least toxic insecticides for use in residential areas to control LDD. So LDD is spongy moth, Lymantria dispar. Its active ingredient is a bacteria which occurs naturally in the environment. BTK has a high specific mode of action in controlling caterpillars and has shown no toxicity to mammals, fish, or other wildlife at the recommended field rates. However, those individuals wishing a near zero exposure to themselves or their children during the spray operation should stay indoors for at least 10 to 20 minutes or use an umbrella to intercept the fine spray, right? So that's why we're on the ground during the spray program. If we see people outside, either ag with the municipality or Forest Service on our state lands, we say, hey, there's a plane coming through within the next amount of time, go underneath a shelter or stay inside, that type of thing. So moving on to the biological effectiveness. So BTK must be ingested by the LDD caterpillar to be effective. Therefore, larval mortality is not immediate and may take up to 10 days for mortality to occur. So one of the reasons why this product BTK is so safe, it's naturally occurring in the soil, which is always kind of a relief to hear that it's naturally occurring. But theoretically, you'd never want to do this, obviously. But theoretically, it is safe for human consumption because the way it works, it actually interacts and becomes active through some of the byproducts as it reacts with an alkaline pH. And human stomachs are not alkaline enough to actually activate or cause this byproduct, but caterpillars' guts are alkaline enough. So that's why it's so effective for spongy moth caterpillars. It's sprayed from the plane or sprayed from wherever. It lands on the leaf. The caterpillar ingests the leaf, and then it actually causes paralysis or rupturing of the gut in the caterpillar, and that's what causes mortality. But so continuing on the effectiveness. Generally, the new dosage rates of BTK used by NJ Department of Agriculture provide good foliage protection and population control. However, proper timing is critical since larger caterpillars are harder to kill. Therefore, extensive shutdowns for any reason could reduce the effectiveness of the pesticide. So, for example, there's a lot of timing that's critical for the use of BTK to control spongy moth. So really, we want to be spraying BTK and having these caterpillars ingest BTK when they're in that instar 1 or 2 stage. Instar 3 is pushing it, and then instar 4, 5, or 6, the caterpillars are so large that it doesn't actually paralyze or rupture the gut. It kind of just gives them a stomach ache where they won't feed for a day or two, and then they'll go back to feeding. So that's why we really need to be very kind of tuned into the stage of the caterpillar, and we really have like a critical window for when we can actually apply this BTK product, which is considered a biological insecticide because it's the active ingredient in it is this bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. So moving on the economic feasibility, so it's sprayed at a dose of 38 BIUs, which is 64 ounces per acre. So that's a half gallon per acre, or if you convert it, that's 1 gallon of product per 2 acres that you're spraying on. And then the general cost that we see each year when we put our contract out to bid with Department of Agriculture is between $50 and $65 per acre. This might not seem super expensive where you're like, oh, I have 5 acres of land, I'll pay someone $200. The reason why it's so inexpensive is because they're treating so many like thousands acres of land, right? Like the amount of work that it would cost, the calibrating, loading up the product, shipping the planes on truck to wherever you're spraying, just to spray. For example, I have a 1 acre of land. If I had, a spongy moth infestation, I'm not going to be able to find any contractor that's willing to spray from a plane just because it's not cost effective for them. So that's why we see this low amount because when a contractor wins the bid, they're spraying a lot larger volume of land or area of land. So the New Jersey Department of Agriculture and the local municipality are currently sharing this cost. So that's that cost share program I mentioned. Then only spray programs utilizing New Jersey Department of Agriculture prescribed insecticide and under state supervision are eligible for these cost sharing funds. So that's municipalities' ability to opt in or opt out of the program. So for example, from my understanding, if a municipality opts out of the cooperative program or cost share program with ag, I don't think that municipality can then go seek or pursue their own contract. It has to be done through the Department of Agriculture. And then what some of you might be interested in, the environmental effects. So BTK has a residual life of less than 10 days. So that's really good. It doesn't sit around for 10 days. So people not wanting to get exposed for it, it's not like, these forever chemicals we're hearing about in the news that last years and years and years. So its residual life is less than 10 days and has little or no impact on non-target organisms. So it really only affects um, caterpillars because of that alkaline nature of their gut. And BTK uh, um, residues do not present a hazard, and sprays can be applied near water or over garden crops without causing adverse effects. So that's what's really nice about it is some of these other chemicals I'll talk about, they work for spongy moth, but they're either more hazardous for humans. There's important timing restrictions, and you can't use them near water at all because it will impact insects that are in that water. Okay, so I talked about kind of large scale management that we at New Jersey Forest Service with cooperation of ag do throughout the state. A lot of you in the audience are probably homeowners that only have a few acres of land and maybe a few individual trees that are infested, or maybe have 10 to 20 acres of land where it's not really feasible for you to pay for a fixed wing aircraft to come spray your land. So I tried to provide some other management options for some of you folks. So for individual tree management, so there is physical and mechanical removal of egg masses. So this is when you actually scrape the egg masses off of the tree. It's important to scrape them and not crush them, because if you just step on them, a lot of times it'll look like the egg masses are gone, but you're kind of just push some of the lower levels of the eggs in that egg masses down into the bark, and those eggs will actually still hatch. Again, this is super limited. You can only get stuff you can reach. Most people aren't going to get on a ladder or rent a bucket truck to do this. So you kind of do what you can reach. The next option is pesticide application. So I tried to separate this into categories to kind of make more sense for people. So there's contact pesticides. So these are pesticides that either need to contact the leaves of the tree you're targeting. So the caterpillars ingest those contacted leaves, and then it causes mortality or control of the caterpillars, or it actually needs to contact the caterpillars themselves. So that's a little bit harder. That's when you need either a bucket truck or a high pressure spray gun to reach the tops of these larger trees. And a lot of times you're hitting stuff you don't intend to hit because you're spraying a product, sometimes 30, 40, 50, up to 100 or more feet into the canopy of a tree. For these larger trees, something that's a little bit better is a systemic pesticide. So this is usually applied either as a root or trunk injection or a soil drench to the tree. So this is where a root or trunk injection is you actually drill small holes around the circumference or base of the tree, and you put these pressurized IVs into it that have this tubing that's attached to the pressurized chemical, and it actually pumps it into the vascular tissue of the tree. And then with the pressure of the pump and then the vascular tissue of the tree, it actually helps translocate it throughout the tree. So it's a little bit easier to apply, especially as a root or trunk injection. It's a closed system, so there's less exposure to humans and any non-target organisms. Soil drenches also work pretty well. Sometimes, you'll hit non-target trees or organisms. This is when you essentially mix a product, pour it around kind of the base of the tree where you expect the roots to be, and then the roots absorb this chemical and then translocate it as well. Just not kind of as pinpoint accuracy as you'll see with this root or trunk injection. For
So
anyone,
Ben, a lot
yeah,
of this has to do with timing also, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll go into the actual pesticides shortly after I go through individual tree management and then kind of like stewardship forest, that 10 or 20 acre management. But a lot of it is important timing, right? Like you don't want to be using contact pesticides when you see, no moths flying around or anything like that. Like contact pesticides, you probably want to hit at that early instar stage because if you're starting to see the late instars, the larger caterpillars, it's likely that some of them may have gone into the pupal stage, or there might even be moths that are laying eggs, and that contact pesticide is not going to work as well. And then same thing with systemic pesticides, right? Like you want to apply the systemic pesticide kind of before those early instar caterpillars start feeding. So immediately when they start feeding, they ingest this pesticide and you're getting control. Whereas, if you're applying the systemic pesticide when the caterpillars are in the late instar stage or they're moths, the moths aren't feeding, so it's not going to affect them. And the late caterpillars might be pupating soon, so they might not ingest enough to actually kill them. So timing on any type of biological or pesticide or chemical you're using is very important. And
Thank
I
you.
kind of default to licensed tree experts. So these are, certified tree experts or arborists in your area. You can find these folks by Googling New Jersey Board of Tree Experts. On that website, there's a business directory tab, so you can actually find the LTE in your area. And the LTE is a contractor that they keep up with continuing education credits, so they kind of know the latest and greatest approach to treating some of these trees, and what makes sense for your situation. So they'll actually
Right, like for example, the systemic is really more for specimen or identified small amounts of trees because it's very expensive, right? Per
Yeah,
trait.
exactly. Yeah. So systemic pesticides, a lot of the ways that they charge you for their service is they'll charge you per inch of tree they're treating. So they'll measure the tree's diameter at 4.5 feet off the ground, and then per inch of diameter they're treating, they charge you a dollar rate. And these dollar rates, depending on the product, depending on who you're getting it from, can range from anywhere as low as like, $5 in per inch, from, depending on what pest you're this is not just spongy moth. This is emerald ash borer, this is beech leaf disease. All of these tree pests kind of are contracted in a similar manner, so it can range from $5 up to $50 or $100 per inch of tree to treat, depending on what you're treating, and when you're treating it and who's treating it. So if you contact an LTE, they'll come assess your tree in question, and a lot of times they'll propose the best, most viable treatment. So whether it's, contact pesticide, a systemic pesticide, or even, potentially utilizing BTK, through, which brings me to my next slide, through drone technology. So this
Excellent.
is this is kind of new cutting edge technology that's slowly being implemented over the last couple of years. I know Andy mentioned, he had talked to some people. Andy Bennett had talked to some people that are doing this or looking to do this in New Jersey. So kind of an example question I proposed is, what can I do if I have 10 acres where treatment of each individual tree isn't feasible, right? It's just way too expensive to treat potentially hundreds of trees across 10 acres, and where, fixed wing aerial application is out of my budget, or, a contractor doesn't want to only get paid for 10 acres of land, right? So that's where this drone technology comes in. So this is what the drone looks like. So I believe this is either a 4 or 6 rotor drone. It has this spray rig on the bottom of it, and then it has the reservoir for the spray solution. So what's cool about this is, the product like BTK, which is, pretty safe to apply, but you normally only see it applied through these larger operations that like our state land suppression program. A drone like this could apply it across 10 or 20 acres and, potentially charge you, the same rate we're getting between that $50 and $65 per acre. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But so this is a cool article from the Penn State Extension. Feel free to Google it and read the whole thing. But essentially, they had a historic tree that they noticed had a really bad outbreak of spongy moth on it, tons of egg masses the previous year, lots of caterpillars as they were observing it. It's a historic tree, so it's very large. So these spray guns and bucket trucks were kind of just out of the potential or possibility. So they were able to contract a company called CNY Drone Services. This specific drone company is out of New York State. If you talk to some of your consulting foresters like Andy, maybe he can help you put you into contact with some of these people. Maybe even some of these LTEs might start offering the services, the licensed tree experts.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting that this is actually the work is almost is a partnership between the forester and the drone company
yeah,
because
very much so.
the
Yeah,
drone company doesn't have the ability to identify where the egg masses are in everybody's forest. So the forester can go out and do that, map that, and provide that mapping information to the drone company. And then the
yes,
drone
yeah.
company employs it. So it's kind of a neat, a very focused and targeted approach. And so it can bring the cost down dramatically.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and like I said, this is a new technology, so there's a lot of kind of learning what the procedure is. There's you need a license to fly a drone. You need to create like a flight log, and depending on if you're applying it to, public land, you need to contact certain people and certain folks, and then, to actually spray these chemicals, you need you need to be a certified applicator, right? So there's a lot of qualifications to do this, and I think eventually, forestry or land management in general is going to kind of be the merging of these technologies and these sciences, where a lot of the people that work with pesticides are going to start getting their drone licenses, and then it's kind of this all-in-one package. So definitely keep an eye out for that. This might be a solution for you if you have more than just a few individual trees to treat, and not enough, not hundreds of acres of land where you could actually feasibly hire fixed wing aircraft. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the common pesticides that are used. I'm not the most well versed in this because when I deal with spongy moth, I'm only dealing with BTK, which is that bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, as well as looking out for some of the biological controls. But some of these chemical or synthetic pesticides, I don't really deal with. This is just kind of my common understanding by talking to partners and doing some research. So the two biological pesticides I mentioned already, BTK, which is a bacteria, and Gypcheck, which is that formulated product from the nucleopolyhedrosis virus. You also have Dimelin, which is an insect growth regulator. So this prevents molting by inhibiting chitin synthesis. So the way this works is it essentially prevents the molting of that exoskeleton, I believe, as the caterpillars go through those instar stages. So it prevents molting, and eventually, I believe the large insect can't survive with that smaller exoskeleton. I'm guessing it might also interfere with the pupal stage, where the actual moth comes out of the pupa. It might prevent the moth from coming out of the pupa. Then some of the other pesticides, again, I've kind of categorized them into both foliar and systemic. Some foliar can also be sprayed as systemic. So there's carbamates. These are carbaryl and 7. I do not advise ever using these pesticides. They're like not really the safest. They have some of the higher case warning words, like the toxic case word, where you need a lot more personal protective equipment to wear it. They work through inhibiting acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter in your brain. And you can have chronic exposure to it or acute exposure to it, which can cause some serious health side effects. Again, if you're applying it properly and you're, the only people that are applying this are, certified applicators, certified pesticide applicators. So it should be entirely safe if they do opt to go this route. Another foliar or contact pesticide are pyrethroids. So these are broad spectrum. So like BTK, only affecting caterpillars. Pyrethroids are broad spectrum, so it's going to affect almost every insect. And the way they work, their method of action is disrupting the nervous system. And some of the common names of these pyrethroids are permethrin, bifenthrin, and cyfluthrin. Then the last foliar kind of application that I know of chemical is organophosphites. So these, like carbamates, are also pretty dangerous, high risk. When humans are exposed to them, they inhibit a different neurotransmitter. So this is cholinesterase, and again, at acute concentrations or chronic exposure can cause risk to humans. So then there's systemic. So these are trunk injections. So these organophosphate products can also be applied through systemic trunk injections. If your only option was to do an organophosphate, I would recommend doing a trunk injection. There's a lot less exposure to you when it's concealed in the tree. Then there's also these neonicotinoids. So these are imidacloprid and dinotefuran. So neonicotinoids are used to control other forest pests like hemlock woolly adelgid, which affects eastern hemlock. There has been a recent ban on neonicotinoids in New Jersey. So I'm not really sure where we're at with that and what that looks like. You might be able to get a special permit to use them, but I believe just the general licensed applicators don't have access to these anymore. And then the last one is emamectin benzoate. So this is, again, a trunk injection, similar to how a lot of neonicotinoids are applied. So this is also used to treat EAB and is not super dangerous. So this is a quick chart I just kind of quickly made through all of them. So the name / active ingredient, the class. So if it's a biological, so we have our BTK bacteria or NPV or Gypcheck virus. Dimelin, which is the growth regulator. We have our carbamate, our pyrethroids, our organophosphate, and neonicotinoid. I did forget to put emamectin benzoate on this, but that follows a lot of the applications similar to imidacloprid and dinotefuran. So the different application methods, we have some foliar sprays, we have some trunk injections, bark sprays, soil injections. and then kind of where you see the effectiveness. So a lot of these are relatively effective, but these systemics, you do have to inject it. And sometimes if the tree isn't transpiring or translocating a lot of nutrients up and forth between the roots and the leaves of the tree, the uptake of these systemic pesticides can take a while. Sometimes it can be as short as 20 minutes, and sometimes it can be as long as 8 hours, where you actually have a tree hooked up and you're going through treating other trees, and that tree has not taken up the entire material by the end of your 8 hour workday. And then, like I said, a lot of these are important timing. So most of them, the contact pesticides and BTK, you want to look for that early instar. So this is early spring. You're looking for that first or second instar. And then a lot of these systemic applications, you want to hit them as a preventative, right? So you want to hit the tree before the spongy moths, caterpillars are actually out and about. So this is pretty much the end of the presentation. I'm going to jump into one last little section, but I will send this presentation so you all can kind of click through it and have this information. But this is a pretty important website link. I'm sure you can get to it by just Googling New Jersey Department of Agriculture and then Gypsy Moth. This will bring you to a web page that pretty much is just has all the info on the current year spray programs and then past year spray programs. It has defoliation reports for each year. So the acreage of defoliation, the severity of the defoliation, and what municipality that defoliation was in. So very interesting stuff. You can kind of see, if your region has been defoliated, consecutive years in a row, and if your region has been treated consecutive years in a row. So the last thing I'm going to move into is not spongy moth related yet, but it's an outreach program that New Jersey Forest Service has called Pocket Presentations. So these are hosted on the New Jersey DEP YouTube page, and these essentially take a forestry topic and educate the public or whoever it might be on this topic. They're anywhere from 10 to 30-minute videos that have these fun, creative animations and just show a lot of relevant information on these topics. And so far we have 4 of them. I think we're working on presentation 5 and 6, hopefully over the summer. We have one on carbon, one that talks about forest data, how it's collected, what it's used for. We have a topic on why it's important to manage the forest and when forest management can and should be implemented. And then the last one is involving silviculture. So essentially different types of forest management and when they can be utilized and implemented based off of, whatever objective you're looking for your woodlands. And I believe I have a quick trailer for one of these, maybe. Let's see if it progresses. I may have left it off. Yeah, so I think that's, let's see, I think my presentation may have just froze. Yeah, so I think that's all I have. Let me see if I can.
No worries, Ben, because Courtney ran it when she
Okay,
did
cool.
she did
Awesome.
hers. So,
Awesome.
yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely. So that was just a tremendous presentation, and I thank you so much for it. It looks like you hit virtually all the questions that were out there. There is a question that seems to be recurring, which is, how does BT affect other caterpillars, native caterpillars?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So like I said, it's a pretty targeted biological insecticide that deals with spongy moth caterpillars. So it's specific to caterpillars, but it will target, native caterpillars and sometimes potentially threatened or endangered species of caterpillars. But what's important is, since, we as a state, that's a product we use, we have a lot of internal checks and balances where they go through to different programs. So if we set up a suppression program, we send the geospatial data of where we intend to implement the suppression program to like Fish and Wildlife, and they kind of cross-check it to make sure there's no caterpillars in that area that would be problematic to, with application of BT. If it's in, for example, like monarch butterflies, if there's an area where a monarch butterfly population is known to be and there's spongy moth, well, unfortunately the monarch butterflies kind of take precedence and take priority, so that area just will not get treated via BT.
Could you talk for a minute? I know you gave some links, but one of those links, I believe, points to the current program and the mapping and how
Yes.
people can see which areas are being sprayed or planned to be sprayed this year.
Yeah, so I just posted that in the chat to both. Oh, that's host and panelists. All right, let me do. Hmm. I don't know. Is everyone able to see that? Hopefully everyone's able to see that. Um, the link I just put in the chat. So yeah, so the first link is to the New Jersey Department of Agriculture website for
And I
smart.
think you want to click to and go to everyone in the two.
So it only allows me to select hosts and panelists
Okay.
and
All
NJ.
right.
So if you
Um,
just want to copy and paste it, if you're able to see to everyone, yeah, I'm not sure I have permissions to post to everyone.
got it.
Um, But yeah, so hopefully y'all can see them soon. So yeah, the first link, there you go. Okay, now I see it to everyone from you. So the first link is to that New Jersey Department of Agriculture website. Should be pretty straightforward to navigate. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see all the different suppression programs. It goes as back as far as 2007, and then as recent as this year's program, 2025.
But I noticed there was like a question about, well, I'm near the state forest. I'm hoping to benefit from that spraying. So it's if you can look at your current map and
Yeah,
see
so you can
where
look at
that's
the
being.
Yeah, and kind of get a sense of it. So we also do good neighbor blocks as part of our program with New Jersey Department of Agriculture. So the way we kind of prioritize what we're going to treat on state lands is high traffic areas. So this is like playgrounds, campsites, recreation areas, picnic areas, just because there's not enough funding to treat every single thing. And we really want to keep trees healthy that are in areas where people are most frequenting. Um, but there might be, someone might live adjacent to kind of the middle of nowhere of a state land somewhere. So if Department of Agriculture deems that property that is, not state land property that's adjacent to state lands is being treated, we have an obligation to treat X amount of feet into state lands, to make sure that like, hey, if that private residence is treated, we don't want infestation coming from state lands that we might not be treating just because of tightness of funding coming onto their property. So it's kind of like this buffer system. That's why it's called the good neighbor. We're trying to be a good neighbor too.
But I think in general, people have to realize that you originally talked about there was 15,000 acres that was cut to about half to 7,500
Yes.
acres,
Yeah.
and there were 140,000 acres affected last year
Yeah.
total. And
So
so we're treating a very small percentage.
yeah, so that's the difficult part is there's always kind of these reservoirs where untreated areas, populations can kind of persist even through a treatment. So if you treat one area, there's always the potential, but you can be hopeful it doesn't happen, but for them to migrate from an untreated area into a treated area, normally consecutive years of treatment in the same area kind of takes care of that problem. And like I said, with the biocontrols, especially that virus, as the populations get super high, the virus really has that high efficacy. So you see a lot of mortality. So hopefully, if it's not next year or maybe even the following year, that NPV virus really kind of knocks back the populations and we get under that 10,000 acres of
Right.
defoliation that we would prefer to see.
So just to reemphasize a point you made was if you have any specimen trees or like I'll call them driveway trees or front lawn trees that you want to
Yeah.
protect, call a licensed tree expert.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, call a licensed tree expert. You can find one in your area, so they don't have to travel as far. Most of them will come out and give you a free quote. They'll look at your tree and they'll say, "Hey, this is what's going on. Who knows? Maybe it's not spongy moth. Maybe it's forest tent caterpillar or eastern tent caterpillar."
Oh,
But yeah, they'll help you with anything and everything. Not just spongy moth. They can help you with beech leaf disease or emerald ash borer, any of that stuff. So they're
right.
they're
And
really the
they're the
go-to.
people who are dealing with the small quantities of trees. And then
Yes,
for the
yeah.
wood,
So some of those companies might be bigger where they're willing to take on, an entire wood lot. But normally what I would say is if you have 10, 20, 50, 100 acres that you're looking to manage, that's when you reach out to the consulting forester list. So that's someone like Andy or someone similar to Andy. That's
yeah, the Andy you're mentioning is Andy Bennett, by the way, just so
yes, Andy Bennett. Yeah.
in
Just
case
because I
anybody.
figure most folks will know who he is.
Yeah. But and some questions on here on Cape May, a national wildlife refuge being treated.
So I don't, so if it's a national wildlife refuge, that is federal land. So we, as a state entity, do not treat federal land. So that's entirely up to like, the USDA, which the U.S. Forest Service is part of. So that's another kind of issue we see is that, so we'll treat state lands in the Northwest around, in Sussex County, around, one of the big federal lands up there is the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. So if they're not treating that, which I don't think they have, or I'm not sure if they ever have, if they're not treating that and we're, regularly treating around that, there's always the potential for that to kind of be a reservoir and for those insects to migrate out. But so I don't believe that the federal government, the U.S. Forest Service, is treating Cape May National Wildlife Refuge Area. I
So,
know municipalities were treated in Cape May this year, so hopefully that offers some relief. But no state lands were treated in South Jersey.
so just to sum up, if you have concerns now, immediately contact your approved forester.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And like the sooner you can do it, the better, because even over the next couple weeks, it's kind of getting a little bit later where the caterpillars
Right.
are going to be going through their instars and becoming less susceptible. And I did see a question about birds. There are some birds that eat spongy moth, like the caterpillars. It's not really a preferred source just because of those hairs it has on them. They have on them, but the bird predation on the caterpillars is not really enough to make any type of significant control on the populations of caterpillars. But every now and then you will see a bird flying around with one in an area where there's a large population of them.
We're just glancing briefly at the chat here to see some trailing questions.
Yeah, so I see Paul's question. I agree. It seems like every 5 years there's, spongy moths has been around for a while, but every 5 years there's a new pest that comes out. But the best advice I can say is stay the course, try to be, active in managing, reach out to your licensed tree experts, reach out to, state and government groups, nonprofits, New Jersey Tree, Foundation, Forestry Association, everyone, to get advice and how to approach this stuff. If you notice you have a pest and you don't have the means to treat the pests, start underplanting it with native trees, other native trees that might not have a bad pest there. But I definitely know that feeling defeated. I mean, it's my career, so
Well,
I
it
deal with
was
it every
interesting.
day.
Ben and I had a discussion about this, that a lot of the questions had an air of helpless feeling because it's such a large battle being fought. And I lost many ash trees, and it is a bit depressing. But on the other hand, we're doing good work and important work in owning our woodlands and managing them. And these problems are going to keep occurring. There's just
Yeah.
no doubt about it. But I would encourage people not to feel defeated.
Yeah, and you can kind of see over time, right? Like that's a big thing with invasive species. As travel and industry across continents becomes more and more popular and more accessible, the likelihood of invasive species getting introduced is just that much greater, right? So there, part of the forest health program that I work with that a lot of states implement is, looking for invasive species before they really get established and become problematic. So that's it's called EDRR, early detection and rapid response. So we do that as well, but in cases like spongy moth where it's established long before any of us were alive, we just do what we can to try and management. And
Well, just look
hopefully,
back at your chart when that year was 800,000 acres
yes, yeah, 800,000.
affected.
If you think 140,000 is bad, it could always be worse. So,
Right,
um,
but look how far we've come, and look at the gaps in the large outbreaks.
yeah, very much so. Yeah, and
So,
we're hoping that next year it's a huge fall off and decline of defoliation acres and acres
right.
that are
So,
infested.
the point being that these things ebb and flow,
Yep.
and we have to stay strong and stay in contact with the Forestry Association. We try to bring you as much information as possible. This was just a great presentation, Ben, super useful for everyone who attended, and I thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry if I jumped around a lot. It's a very in-depth topic, so I tried to just kind of give an overview of as and many of the facets as I could with Spongy Moth. So thank you for having me. Thank you for attending.
So, thank you. Come back soon, maybe on a friendlier subject.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you, and have a good night to everyone.
Absolutely. Take care all. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks.
you.